Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's been a bit of time since we've all connected again virtually. So, welcome. We have an incredible interview today, which I'm really looking forward to. It's with Sarah Jo Soldovieri, and she's an incredibly accomplished. There's a long list of accomplishments, but I'll just give everyone the highlights. She's a third year doctoral student studying inclusive education and disability studies at Syracuse University. She works as a graduate assistant and researcher in the Department of Teaching and Leadership. She's recognized nationally as an inclusive education scholar and advocate. She's worked to create and implement over 1,500 inclusive individualized education plans, otherwise known as IEPs, with complex support needs. And her work centers on these students in inclusive settings, inclusive higher education, education policy, decentering whiteness in education, disability justice, transitioning from inclusive education to complex employment, and pre-service inclusive education training. And I am so excited. This is going to be an incredible conversation. Welcome, Sarah Jo. We're excited to talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Welcome, welcome. And a little introduction to us, if just for everyone involved. It's myself, Joanna McElnay, and we are the community managers. I'm the community manager for Creative Spirit, and my colleague Manalcolm Repburn.
I'm the communications manager for Creative Spirit.
And he's an incredibly talented writer.
Nice.
So we're going to dive in. We have some great questions today, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Let me pull. Oops. There we go. So Sarah, could you give us all just a quick or long, either, whatever. Can you define inclusive education for our audience, please?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. When I think about inclusive education, really my work focuses on how can we make schools, universities, colleges, places that meet everyone's needs. I think there's a really narrow box of what we think of as a typical student. And that typical student is often non-disabled, they're white, they're English speaking. And when we think about inclusive education, I think about making a space where every student, regardless of disability, regardless of modality of language, regardless of cultural background, is brought in and valued for who they are. We're not trying to fix students. We're not trying to, mold them into something different. And on a very tangible level, when I think about K-12 schools, we don't have segregated special education. We don't have these rooms in the basement or in trailers in the backyard that we send students who are disabled. We bring the supports to them. And rather than this kind of medicalized notion of fixing or curing or rehabilitation, we're meeting students where they're at with the supports that they need to make all the progress that they can with self-determination, with culturally sustaining practice, so that we can create a future that folks have autonomy over what they want to do. So it's my very brief introduction to inclusive education. But I could go on for hours about it.
I know it's so interesting because I know that's one of the pillars, that we talk about at Creative Spirit is really developing independence and financial independence, specifically through employment. And I think that's something great that we kind of work together on from both sides. And I know that's something that you're very passionate as well.
Well, and it's not just this kind of like fluffy idea of like everyone should be together because that's the right thing. Yes, it is the right thing. And yes, it is a human right. And yes, it is, the UN CRPD has told us this is a human right. But also the research tells us students who are in gen ed classes, who get the supports brought to them, are more likely to be employable, are more likely to have competitive wage jobs, are more likely to be living independently. It's not a mistake that students who are in what we would call inclusive education, who are not in separate segregated spaces to receive these services, are better able to, or more likely to be in competitive wage jobs. There is direct lines. I've done research looking at students who are in segregated self-contained programs in states where there's still sheltered workshops, where we're making, with the 14C certificate, where we're paying disabled folks pennies on the hour to do a job. Direct line from segregated special education to sheltered workshops. And in some cases, I see these actually written into students' IEPs right from as early as 3 years old. Oh, their trajectory is a segregated space. We're going from a segregated education to a segregated sheltered workshop, where you're going to make as low as 3 cents an hour.
Yeah, and that's incredibly, especially as someone with a disability myself, I think it's really disheartening to hear that segregated workshops are still a goal for individuals, and that there's nothing better, and that this has been 100 years of, sort of a system that needs an evolution, and now is the time to have that evolution, I believe. And I think it's really interesting hearing your perspective on it, that it can start as young as 3 years old, that people can have that goal of graduating to the couch, essentially, where you're not able to have a lifestyle that is independent from family or caregivers or government supports or any of that, because you're considered almost second class or less in a lot of cases. It's incredibly disheartening.
I was in an IEP meeting earlier, and the question was, well, for the student who is in early elementary school, well, what job does the student want? What realistically, and that term I hear, realistically, kind of condescendingly, do you think the student is going to have? And I said, wait a minute, for any student, if you asked me in early elementary school what I wanted to be, I would have told you like a princess or dancing on Broadway or something. And guess what? I'm not doing any of those things. But for disabled folks, we have this unrealistic expectation that the only thing we can do is teach them to wipe down tables to become employable, as opposed to giving, self-determination, giving access to what does the student want to do. That student wasn't even in the meeting. What does that student want to do? We're here talking about this disabled person's life as if they have no autonomy over their future, and there's a real problem with that, and I think it's a real problem in our education system, and it parlays into employment. There's a reason folks with intellectual disabilities are so underemployed, and I would argue that that's because of segregated education.
Oh my God, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I think when I was diagnosed in college, my junior year, which I had to do because I was failing my classes, that I wanted to be a poli-sci major and be an environmental lawyer, and I couldn't keep up with the readings, and I didn't know what was going on. And it was, when I got my diagnosis, it wasn't exciting. I wasn't proud of it. It was something I hid. And it took me a long time to accept that part of myself and realize this is not going to stop me from reaching whatever goal I have. And it still is something that I struggle with, but I think every day it gets easier, and being around supportive folks like yourself, and being in a workplace that it feels safe for the first time ever in my career, I think is really exciting. And wow, what can we do, in your opinion, what do you think we can do to foster that change in the employment sector, and kind of make people with disabilities understand that there are those that are looking to help them and make their dreams come true, essentially, and that they deserve to have those dreams, and that they deserve to have a pathway to achieve them, and that even if it's a little bit different than others around them, how they get there, they can get there no matter what.
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting, something that really hits home with me as some, I identify as a neurodiverse scholar, and getting those support needs as someone who's getting a PhD looks very different than someone who's getting support needs in other realms, right? And I think this idea of disability pride, and just like, it is so key, because disability is not a bad word. Like, we don't need these like euphemisms of like differently able. Like, disabled is not a dirty word. Disabled is not a bad word, and it's something, I think if we first stop stigmatizing disability as if it's something to be, ashamed of, or in some cases eradicated, because there are folks who make their entire careers off of eradicating disability. I mean, eugenics is still alive and well, and there's no way we can have a system of employment and at the same time have a system of folks who are trying to quite literally erase disability. So I would say the first thing we need to do as a society is say, disability is not a bad thing. And that's something that, I think about for myself in a multitude of identity, right? If I had, from early elementary school, learned about disability pride, learned about LGBTQ pride, learned about all these other things, how different that would be. And knowing that these supports that we're entitled to and entitled to by law they're not extra, they're not special, they're just what give us full access. I also think we need to look at like the bureaucracy behind things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There's a lot of onus that gets put on the disabled person. And when we look at those who are at the intersections of multiply marginalized identities, and in a society that is, rooted on racist and white supremacy, that is not going to be accessible for so many folks. In order to have ADA enforced, you have to get a lawyer. To get a lawyer, you need money. And if you don't have that capital, or if you don't have the linguistic capital, the resistant capital to be able to push through and continue on these things, you're not getting what you're legally entitled to. Although we shouldn't need laws to uphold basic human rights, but we do. That's the world we live in. Looking at things like people love to praise the ADA. ADA is leaving out a huge portion of the disabled population. It's leaving out folks who don't have money. It's leaving out folks with intellectual disabilities. And I really think it's time that we look at the laws. I would even look at IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, which again, at their time were revolutionary ideas, but are failing today. New York subway system has less than 30% of their entire public transit that is accessible. And they've been hit with lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and it doesn't matter. So even folks who have the capital to do that, or organizations who have the capital to do it, it doesn't do anything. So we need to completely relook at how we have enforcement of these civil rights laws to get to a place where we need to be. We also need to look at how we're training folks in HR, how we're training employers to work with disabled folks. We have massive mistakes that are happening all the time. I think about a story I heard of, someone's diagnosis being sent out to the entire company. We have issues with disclosure. We have, I was lucky enough to take a law class. So a few law classes at Syracuse College of Law. And so I have a good, I would argue, a really good understanding of the law. But short of that, how would you know what your rights are? No one's out there spelling it out for you. And it's certainly not in accessible language. It's certainly not in plain language. So we need to look at the law. We need to look at how we're training folks. And we need to look at things like although, folks can now save money with an ABLE account, we can still do more. And we still need to do more to incentivize, competitive employment for folks to hire disabled folks and to keep and retain disabled folks.
Oh my God, I'm applauding everything that you just said. I think it's so amazing, because I think I'll start with one response that I think is so interesting, because I was able to meet Sandra Swift-Perino, who was the only woman on the committee developing the Americans with Disabilities Act, and she is a white blonde woman with blue eyes. It's the typical Anglo-Saxon look, feel, kind of the problem, right? And the fact there was no one else involved that was of diverse background or different social class structure, anything like that. And when you talk to Sandra, she is so well educated. She's probably one of the most inclusive people I've ever met. And she is a great advocate for inclusive and the evolution of the ADA into something more practical. I mean, she had great ideas around centralizing information to solve problems. She had great ideas, you know, and that's one woman against however many men there was on the committee. And, you know, you think about it, this was in the 70s, right? So we've had 50 years and no one has taken up the mantle to really innovate. And it takes innovation and adaptation of these policies within our culture and society to make change. And this leads into the second problem, which is coming to disclosure, right? The safety and security of our jobs are threatened when we disclose. And I've had both sides of the story where I hid it. I was closeted about my disclosure when I first came out, and it was the most anxiety producing experience. I had panic attacks almost weekly for 7 months. It was a really stressful experience. And then when I took some time off and I went to a different career with the support of Creative Spirit, it was so different. But even in our day-to-day work at Creative Spirit, we come up against the roadblocks that you mentioned around education, people not understanding, exclusion in terms of, you know, ideologies that say that disability should be, you know, genetically removed, and so much more. And even being disclosed, you still hit the roadblocks, right? That's not exactly the solution, but it's a step, right? Because what it does is it takes us out of the closet to be around people that could support us, that might have the power, and together we might be able to bring change. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that.
Absolutely. And all of these things, you know, were steps forward, right? And they were steps forward, but they were steps forward for really particular groups of disabled people. You know, I really, you know, give thanks to my colleagues here, and especially my cohort members, of pushing me to think about that inclusion is not the goal. The goal is to dismantle these systems that require inclusion to even be a concept that we need. You know, yes, IDA was monumental in the 70s. Yes, ADA was monumental in the 90s. We're now in 2022, and we're still leaving out those who are at the intersections of most marginalization and systematic oppression. And so, yes, we need to continue, and we can't have, you know, these conversations about legislators and policy without also acknowledging that there are states where many disabled folks' right to vote are stripped away by virtue of things like guardianship. So all of these issues are so interconnected, right? When we have the autonomy of choice taken away from anyone, including voting, we can't possibly say that we're going to have a policy that's representative of the entire population when we have large factions of the US that don't have access to that right to vote.
Oh my God, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned the interconnectedness, like that knot of issues come together, which often scares people off from trying to innovate and solve the problem. I'm the opposite. I think the more complex, the more interesting, but that's just me.
Me too.
Yeah. And so I think the problem is it's similarly looked at like education as like a problem child within social structure that is too difficult to sort of take on and make change. But I think we also need to address the mindset of that and say, if something is too hard, so we're just going to exclude it and only choose the easy route. Like that is a huge mindset that I think our generation has built into, which is, oh, we're going to pick the easy way. Like my work needs to be easy. I want to just make enough money to go on a fancy trip or go wherever, right? If you're privileged enough to get an education and get those jobs in those elite sections, not even talking about, you know, getting to there, right? Like the boundaries that involve getting a higher education degree, getting a high school degree, and so much more. But I think it's really fascinating because that mindset is also a problem, right? Because we're talking about the future. And a lot of these individuals that wrote these policies are in their 70s and 80s, and no one has wanted to touch these issues since then. So how do we encourage sort of the next generation? This is something you probably deal with every day as a teacher and as an educator, is how do we motivate the mindset of the next generation to want to get involved in disability advocacy, disability rights work, and make people understand that these are things that are solvable, but we do need to take ownership of them. We can't just exclude them like we've done.
I think about, that a lot of these things, it's who I think it's who we're listening to, because we have generations of disability justice work, of mutual aid, of Black and Brown disabled folks telling us, what we need to be doing, and we've been willfully ignorant and chose not to listen. So I would say we need to change who we're listening to. For so long, disability advocacy has been parent driven. IDEA was driven by a collective group of parents, and not that there's anything wrong, with parent advocacy. I want to be very clear about that. I engage with a lot of parent advocacy, but I do think it's time that we switch the torch from parents to disabled folks, and we listen to those who are most marginalized. One of the principles of disability justice is leadership by those most impacted. And so when we're thinking about policy, when we're thinking about education, we're thinking about employment, we need to step back and give leadership to those who are the most impacted. And I think that's how we do it. Otherwise, we're going to be making small incremental gains for a small group of folks who are by large white, who have economic capital, and when we think of, and now I'm transitioning back to things are hard. I think about the Tayshoff Center at Syracuse University, and the Inclusive Youth Program. It's not that it's easy to run arguably the most inclusive college program for folks with intellectual disabilities. It's hard. We do a lot of work, but it's worth it. But guess what? It's also really hard to have a D1 basketball team, and we do it. It's also really hard to have a top school of, management. It's also really hard to do all of these things. But we don't seem to want to put the work into, disabled folks. And we have the models, right? We have Inclusive U, which has an astronomically high rate higher than any other university that I am personally aware of, of graduates who are competitively employed. We know what it says. We have decades of research to tell us. We have decades of grassroots advocacy to tell us. And it's about who are we listening to?
I love that, and I think that's great. I could talk to you for hours because I find this fascinating. I'm going to close us out here, though, because I think we're going to be close to their mark time. But, and, maybe we do a follow-up to this. I think this is a great kickoff spot, and maybe we talk about, how, individuals can walk through their journeys and be of support to this if they choose to another time, because I think that would be an incredible topic to explore. And we have that pipeline at Creative Spirit. I think I'm so grateful that is the focus on our work, especially on the content and communication side, is really connecting all of us, whether it's online because we're in a pandemic or in person when we are able to come out, to come together to find solutions and have these great discussions. Because I think it also takes all of us coming together and sharing our ideas, and then finding outputs from there. Because that's the other thing, right? We're so isolated as a part of this community, but also right now because of a pandemic. So I think both of those things are working against us. But if we're able to connect online, let's do it. Let's make it as big and as proud and as productive as we possibly can with the most positive outputs. If that's the goal, obviously realism is also a factor in that goal. But I think coming together is really important. Having that bench of support is really important. And I'm just so grateful, Sara, that you're here with us, because this is everything that we talk about on our internal teams and everything. And grateful to Syracuse that the work that you guys are doing is helping from the education side, because it really does matter. Is there any closing sort of place that people should go to get more information about the work that you're doing? Anything you'd like to share, advice-wise?
Absolutely. I would say, for folks who are thinking about, now we have had this explosion of access to inclusive higher education. So access to colleges and universities through different pathways for folks with intellectual disabilities specifically. And we have the only and largest conference for this field. The state-of-the-art conference will be held at Syracuse University, October 19th and 20th. Coupled with that, we have the Student Leadership Conference, which is for students who have intellectual disabilities who are attending or thinking about attending inclusive post-secondary programs. And we've seen such great success at Syracuse through Inclusive U on outcomes and things for our students. And I would encourage folks who want to learn more about what is now offered for inclusive post-secondary education to check out the State-of-the-Art Conference. We're going to be in person in Syracuse. And from there, you'll hear from experts in the field on inclusive post-secondary and why this is so important for students and should be an option. You know, college may not be for everybody, but college should be an option for everybody. And we know like there's only one group that we say you have to be completely employable the day they exit high school, and that is disabled folks. And that is an unfair marker to hold. Whereas the rest of us get to go, you know, if we're able to go to college and explore our likes and interests and get training there. So I really am encouraged by the exclusion of programs. Hopefully more come along to be more inclusive, because there is a wide range of who has access again to those you know, matriculated or what would be considered kind of gen ed spaces. But I would encourage folks really, you know, to look into that as kind of as an ending point. And I'm always happy to be back. You know how to get a hold of me.
You're the best. And thank you so much. This has been so educational. And Malcolm and I are always available to do another follow-up interview. So thank you so much. And we look forward to that.
Thank you so much for having me.